Childish pranks are not always so harmless. Many young people, very often without thinking about the consequences, come up with sometimes very dangerous games for themselves. Kids sometimes cannot correctly assess the degree of danger of some of their games. Very often, parents are not even aware of what their children are doing. After all, parents are not informed about such pranks because kids know that they are doing wrong and cannot admit it to their parents. Every time children do something forbidden, they expose themselves to a risk. The risk of getting into a situation in which they can seriously suffer and can sometimes even be fatal. But children do not think about that. They completely surrender to the call of their childhood fantasies and excitement. In today's story, we will talk about just such an act of children for which they could pay very seriously, pay with their own lives, if nature itself had not intervened in the matter. On that day, a wild animal behaved not characteristic of its species, which greatly surprised people because if everything had gone just a little differently that day, then there would have been 2 less children on Earth. February winters are famous for their inconsistency. Usually by February in many northern regions, the frosts are already weakening and the ice on the rivers is thinning in many places. Therefore, in the second half of winter, closer to spring, people already try to avoid crossing on foot, and they use the bridges more, even if it is necessary to make a large detour. Of course, adults are well aware of this and try to bypass dangerous sections of the river, but children very often neglect these rules. In their opinion, if there is ice on the river, then it must be strong, and of course it can easily withstand the weight of their little bodies. On that February morning in 1983, 2 boys decided not to go to school where their parents had sent them, but to skip school and go sledding. It would seem that many school children at their age neglect parental prohibitions and do rash acts. But on that day, they could not imagine what such disobedience would turn out to be for them. After waiting for their parents to leave for work in the morning, the boys put on fur coats, took their sleds and their book bags for plausibility, and they went tobogganing instead of to school. They lived in a distant village surrounded by high hills and trees. There were plenty of places to ride their sleds, but that day they decided to find a new place for entertainment. They went far from their house to find the highest slope, which had fewer trees that could prevent them from sliding down the hill at a high speed without hindrance. After a while, they found the ideal place, in their opinion. The slope was quite high. There were a few trees along the way, and at the foot of the mountain there was an icy river. For their own reassurance, they ran a couple of times out onto the ice of the river to make sure that the ice was strong enough, and they happily started riding their sleds. The area was quite deserted, and they shouted and laughed loudly, not fearing that some adults might notice them and scold them and take them home to their parents. And only behind a row of trees was a snow-covered road along which only occasional cars drove and rare passers-by passed, but there was no way to see them from the road. They were hidden from prying eyes by thick branches of trees. The boys frolicked heartily. For about an hour, they tirelessly drove down the mountain and climbed it again. Then they finally got bored and they decided to go down the hill together because then the speed would be higher and twice the fun. One of the boys sat down more comfortably in the sled, and the second settled in behind, taking hold of the first one more tightly, and began to accelerate the sled to gain more speed. He was pushing the sled in front of him, and he himself ran faster and faster after them. And in the end, when the sled was going so fast that he barely had time to run after them, he jumped right on top of the first boy, and they rushed down the mountain with a loud laugh. At great speed, the sled was carried from the mountain to the river. They managed to hear a crunch under them, but they could not do anything about it. The ice crunched very loudly under the runners and eventually cracked. They fell through the ice at full speed. The sled instantly went to the bottom, but the boys began to flounder in the icy water, trying to get out of their icy captivity. The water instantly soaked them through and through. The already heavy winter clothes became a heavy stone to pull them down. In addition, it was very difficult to breathe because the icy water pressed very hard on their lungs. They tried to scream as best they could, but they only managed to emit hoarse groans. At this moment, one of the boys remembered how his father once told him that a man who falls into ice-cold water in winter can withstand a maximum of 15 minutes before he finally freezes, and a child even less. True fear seized the boys. They frantically grabbed for life and for ice, but if you've ever seen people fall through the ice, you probably understand that the edge of the ice is constantly breaking off under the weight of the human body, and it becomes almost impossible to get out of it. About 3 minutes passed, and for them it seemed like an eternity. By that time, they were already tired of desperately floundering in the icy water and just crying in silence, not knowing what to do next. They understood that if no one came to their aid in the near future, they were simply doomed. Then one of the boys saw in the distance a large dog, which was very quickly approaching them. He shouted to his brother that the dog must have heard their cry and was now leading some adult to help and would soon arrive. The boys had sincere hope that now some man would come out of the forest, quickly come running to their aid and pull them out of the water. But except for the dog, no one came out of the forest to meet them. As the animal approached, they realized with horror that it was not a dog at all, but a huge wolf that was very quickly approaching them. They were terrified and did not know what to do. They realized that they would hardly be able to escape from the wolf in their position. Meanwhile, the wolf approached the edge of the ice, lay down, and began to sniff. Then he carefully took one of the boys by the collar of his fur coat and began to gently pull him out of the water. The boy, numb with horror and numb from the cold, could no longer resist and silently surrendered to the power of this wild beast. The wolf had just incredible physical strength, so he easily pulled the boy out of the water. Then the boy, without wasting a minute of precious time, rushed to help his brother. He found a fallen tree nearby, broke off a large branch, and handed it to his drowning brother. The latter, with the last of his strength, grabbed the last opportunity to get out of the river and very tightly held onto it, while his brother persistently pulled him out of the ice. After a couple of minutes of such effort, the second boy managed to get ashore. They lay exhausted on the riverbank, looked at the sky, and could not believe their happiness that they managed to get out of the water. Then they remembered the wolf, began to look around, but the wild beast was nowhere to be seen. Then the boys got up and, supporting each other, went to the side of the road where they were picked up by a passing truck. In the car, they told the driver what had happened to them. He gave them hot tea from his thermos and covered them with his traveling blanket to give them at least a little warmth. He took them to their village and handed them over to their parents. The parents listened in horror to what had happened to their children that day. On one hand, they were incredibly happy that everything ended well, and on the other hand, they wanted to give the children a real beating for not obeying their parents, skipping school, and leaving alone without asking for a ride to an unfamiliar place, and even so far from home. This story was then passed on by word of mouth in the village. Elderly people said that it was the soul of their deceased relatives who appeared in the guise of a wolf and helped the children. They really believed this could happen. Others, more skeptical, said the boys had made up the wolf part of the story to get everyone's attention, that boys at their age have a very active imagination and love to come up with all sorts of stories. But the local biology teacher put forward his hypothesis regarding the case. In his opinion, the wolf simply mistook them for his relatives because they were in fur coats that resembled animal skins. In a word, for whatever reason this happened, they were very lucky to stay alive that day. How do you explain this strange behavior of the wolf? Share in the comments your opinion on the action of this wild animal. And if you enjoyed this story, then click like and subscribe to the channel because we have prepared a lot of interesting stories for you.